in the self-emptying. Excuse me for a second, I wrote down the wrong number of this page reference here. But Francis calling the brothers, let the whole of humanity tremble, the whole world shake when Christ, the Son of God, is present on the altar. O admirable heights and sublime lowliness, that the Lord of the universe, God and the Son of God, so humbles himself that for our salvation he hides himself unto the little form of bread. Look, brothers, at the humility of God and pour out your hearts before him. Humble yourselves, that you may be exalted by him. Therefore hold back nothing of yourselves for yourself, so that the one who gives himself totally to you may receive you totally. There is no doubt, it seems to me, that in the instructions that Francis gave Clare and her sisters, he returned to many of these same motifs that he shared with the friars. That what this Eucharist is a reminder among us of the self-emptying of God. And Clare, like Francis, saw this self-emptying. It's very interesting, isn't it, that way that we often see Clare pictured in art, carrying the Eucharist, going out, and she was going out on to the window of San Damiano to stand between the Saracen mercenary troops and her sisters. Clare is going out, in a sense, putting herself in the position of danger, standing between the marauding troops and her sisters, carrying the Eucharist. And this is not accidental in many ways, because what the Eucharist is a self-sacrifice of Jesus. And that Jesus in his self-emptying is the model for Clare giving herself. And this continually strikes Clare. Clare, like Francis, follows the footsteps of Christ, not primarily in her heart and her affections, but literally by her body in the world, the way that she concretely lives and serves people. That this inner affection for Jesus and his self-emptying has to be translated into concrete action. One contemporary, poor Clare abbess, has written, and I think she captures this very, very much, this attitude of mutual service. In this shared incompleteness of our common humanity, we recognize in each other the need for meaning, for growth, for healing, for recreation. We do this out of the sameness that bonds us, rather than from the differences that separate us. This being born together in poverty finds us celebrating our dependence on God and one another. It is in recognizing our dependence on the Lord and our free sacrifice of one for the other that we really come to appreciate who Jesus is, how we are called to live a common life of unity. And so the Eucharist then, it seems to me, is a transition from the community that we celebrate in Eucharist, the community of mind and heart, unity of mind and heart, back to the reason for this unity and how this unity can exist. And that is the self-emptying of Jesus, the emptying of love. This is the great theme that we see Clare going back to in the documents that we alluded to, the other main documents other than her rule and testament of her spirituality. And these are her letters to Agnes of Prague, all of which are focused in one way or another on this theme of poverty, the pearl of great price to which the follower of Francis and Clare have committed themselves to. These letters are a relatively recent discovery. Only one of them was known, and that was included in the famous Chronicle of the Friars, the Chronicle of the 24 Generals, the early history of the order that was written in the early 14th century. The other ones were discovered only after 1915, when the British Franciscan historian Walter Seton discovered a manuscript containing them, and he went looking for more, and uncovered the other letters of Clare up to Agnes of Prague. I just want to make a little note here about who this Agnes is as you read those letters. She herself was a remarkable figure in her own way and in her own life. She's a recently canonized saint. She was only canonized in 1989. Interesting enough, just the time when Czechoslovakia was breaking free from Russian domination, and when those celebrations were being held in Prague, as people were having self-determination, they were celebrating also the canonization of a native saint. She was born a princess of Bohemia, a daughter of King Ottokar I of Bohemia. She was born in Prague in 1205, and his wife, her mother, was Constance of Hungary, and she was therefore a first cousin of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary. She was betrothed as a young woman to the Duke of Silesia and sent there at the age of 3. I should say as betrothed as a young woman, she was betrothed as a young girl. And she was sent to live in the court, to be brought up with her future husband, so they would grow to know one another and love one another. But she was only there several years. He died. And she therefore went back to her father's court in hopes of another marriage settlement, which, interesting enough, as time went on, she steadfastly refused. She was betrothed again. She was jilted by the emperor's son, who did not go along with the marriage proposal that his father had made, and another negotiation was made. But as time went on and other offers came her way, she did not accept, and she decided to remain unmarried and dedicating herself to the Lord's service. The Franciscans arrived in Prague when she was a young woman in 1225, and she was rapidly caught up in the Franciscan vision of life that they presented. And in the year 1232, she made a major decision. She had received lands from her brother, and from the inheritance she received, she founded a hospice for the poor, and also a convent for women who would follow the Franciscan way of life. And she wrote a letter to Clare requesting that Clare would send sisters from Italy to found this convent of poor ladies in the city of Prague that she was founding with her own money. In 1234, 5 sisters did arrive from Italy, and at this same time, Agnes and 7 other Czech ladies joined them and entered the convent, and she dedicated herself then to follow in Clare's footsteps in the Franciscan way of life as a poor Clare. This was the occasion for Clare's first letter. The first letter was written at the time of Agnes's entry, and of course makes a great deal of the fact that you have exchanged the royal state, being the daughter of a king, to being the daughter now of the great king and pledging to follow yourself in the path of Jesus. Other letters succeeded this. The last letter, the 4th letter of Clare to Agnes, was sent shortly before Clare's death in 1253. Agnes herself lived on for another 30 years, dying in 1282, and was a very staunch defender of the way of life of the poor ladies that she tried to incarnate there. What comes through very much in the letters of Agnes, the letters of Clare to Agnes, we only have one side of this correspondence, unfortunately. We don't have the letters that Agnes wrote to Clare, just Clare to Agnes, is the notion of poverty. And the notion, the word that is used over and over again by Clare is the notion of exchange. And in the first letter we see what a great and praiseworthy exchange to leave the things of time for those of eternity, to choose the things of heaven for the goods of earth, to receive the 100-fold in place of the one, to possess the blessed eternal life. This theme, of course, is a common one in early Franciscan literature. Perhaps many of you know the early document called the Sacrum Commercium, the story of Francis and his brothers, the holy exchange, whatever this word, commercium, of Francis with Lady Poverty. And this is a common motif, to give up one thing for the other, the exchange that takes place. This word commercium in Latin, by the way, is very interesting. It can be used, translated in many ways. We can see certainly the English word commerce, coming from here, exchange of commodities, exchange of goods, comes in there. It also is a word that is used for intercourse, for sexual union, a mutual giving of one person to the other. It's also a word that can be expressed to translate the word covenant in biblical terms. And so it has a tremendous nuance here. The covenant of Francis with Lady Poverty, for example. And therefore, Francis marries Lady Poverty, and that word commercium could be used to express the relationship of Francis to Lady Poverty. But this is also the word that Clare uses, that we have exchanged so much. We are joining in this sacred relationship with Jesus. It is a word, of course, that goes back to a fundamental Franciscan text in Scripture, a text that impressed Francis so much that he repeats, and that is repeated by so many other early Franciscan writers, that is repeated by Clare in these letters to Agnes. And that is a quote from the second letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 8, verse 9. Christ became poor for us, so that we might become rich by his poverty. The holy exchange that Jesus has taken on himself, has exchanged his divine nature for our human nature, in turn that we might exchange the weakness of our sinful humanity for the riches of his divine life that he shares with us. Jesus has exchanged divinity for humanity that we might exchange our weak and sinful state for Jesus' exalted state. And in a nutshell, that verse encapsulates, of course, the whole Philippians hymn, the hymn which talks about the kenosis, the self-emptying. Jesus, although he was by nature equal to God, did not see this equality as something to be clung to, but rather emptied himself, taking on himself the form of a slave, being made subject to death, even death on a cross. And because of this, God highly exalted him, and us with Christ. This notion of the exchange, the salvific principle that Francis sees going on, the new covenant that has been made between God and humanity through the poverty of Christ, that in fact this is the decisive thing that has united humanity with God. It is through God's voluntarily self-emptying in the person of Jesus that has bound humanity to God by a bond that can never be broken. It is through Jesus' self-emptying that we are united with God. And therefore, of course, the meaning is very, very clear. That if we are really, truly to appreciate our union with God, if we are to enter this union, we too, in our own way, therefore, must empty ourselves. If we are to enter this holy exchange, we must enter into this mystery of the self-emptying of God. We must empty ourselves and enter into the dynamic of giving ourselves back to God. What Francis and Clare stress so over and over again in this notion of poverty, because again, it is not primarily an ascetical notion of poverty, although certainly there is asceticism contained in it. It is a notion of poverty which comes from entering into the mystery of Jesus. As Clare summarizes in her fourth letter to Agnes, Christ is the mirror. We look at Jesus, we see ourselves, and we must be transformed totally into that image. What Clare is saying is our whole focus has to be on Christ. I think that we can imagine her saying, if we were talking about her, she would probably tell us today, don't talk about me, talk about Jesus. That the important thing for all of us as we are growing in our Christian life is to focus on the person of Christ. And as a superior, she does not focus on herself, but draws her sisters into this mystery of the self-emptying of Jesus, that they too might be integrated in it. This is a value certainly that appealed to Clare even in her youth. That's one of the things that we saw when she was a young woman. She was always a generous person. She was always empathetic. She was always ready to give of what she had for the needs of others. She denied herself many times of the good things that she had in order to give them to the poor. But this was not enough for her. And this is where the decisive influence of Frances came into her life. It was not simply enough to give out of her abundance to the poor, but that she had to become poor to really experience the fullness of the gospel. She had to empty herself totally, not restricting herself to the simple necessities of life, procuring her food and her clothes and the things that she absolutely needed in order that she could experience the total goodness of God. I think for us, many times we have such a negative connotation of poverty, and this colors our mind. We think of destitution in the United States, in this country. We think of street people. We think of the beggars that are increasingly obstreperous on some of our big city streets looking for handouts. And there's little here that attracts us to the very profound spiritual value of poverty, that freely relinquishes what people are ordinarily striving for so that we can find God. So much of our energies are satisfied by, quote, temporal things. So many times in our lives we're so focused on things that it's hard to deal with the inner spiritual needs that all of us have. You think of the consumerism in our society, the compulsive need we have to be entertained, people working harder and harder and longer for things that they don't really need, that it would take their whole lifetime to consume these things. And yet our whole lives become focused on achieving things, and we are not attentive to the inner spiritual hunger we all have to be nourished and fed by God. And paradoxically, it is, Clare believes, it is this self-emptying from the concerns, the obsessive concerns that so often consume us, that free us to really enjoy the good gifts that God is continually giving us. That it is the blindness that material things so often can set up in our lives that keep us from enjoying God. I think to understand poverty, it is not, quote, negative stripping away as much as it is what are the things that are really keeping me from enjoying God's good gifts. That my obsessive concern with things keeps me from enjoying myself as a gift of God and other people as a gift of God. The Franciscan poverty is a response to the mystery that Francis and Clare constantly go back to, that God alone is good. God is simply the self-giving mystery. God has created all good things. He has created this world and all good things that we might see in that His goodness. The world is good. Certainly there is sin and darkness in the world. What we humans have done to our world, what we do continually day in and day out in our world, the cares and the anxieties of the world. But the basic problem in our world that we go back to continually, the Franciscan believes, the evil in our world ultimately can be reduced to the evil of self-appropriation, of self-aggrandizement. That people's attitude is one of reaching out, grasping things for themselves, whether that is possessions, whether that is pleasure, whether that is power. This need that somehow I have to build myself up rather than standing back in gratitude, accepting the gifts of God. That Clare, quote, leaving the world, not being dependent on anything, set her free to live in the reality of the gift of God. That her poverty enabled her to accept the world, to accept other people, to accept herself as the gift of God. And the real task is to live in that mystery of God's gift to us. There's a real struggle here, obviously, to remain within an experience of gift, of emptying ourselves to experience the richness of God. And this is the mystery of this holy exchange. I exchange, really, my obsessive concern with myself, but in return, I really become rich by learning to accept myself and others in this world as a gift from God. Not something which I can control and manipulate, but as something which the Lord gives to me. Jesus has come into the world in so many ways to reveal the world and humanity to itself. Jesus lives in that experience of giftedness, receiving everything from his Father, as he tells us over and over again, living out that reality of that relationship of love, returning all to God. This is the way Jesus lives. This is the way that we must live. Christ redeems us precisely through his poverty. He does not take on poverty as something external to his humanity, but rather his very way of living in this world as a transient, if you will, begging his humanity from the love of his Father, from the womb of the Virgin Mary. Living that out as a human being in the midst of our world is the way that Jesus redeems. Redemption occurs because Jesus has reestablished in this world the reality, the experience of gift, that he is totally dependent on the God who creates the world as good. The experience that Jesus tells us, do not be afraid, little flock. It is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. And the reality of poverty is to live in the experience of that gift. Clare has a wonderful expression that she refers to, actually, the figure of Francis. And this was pointed out to me by Mary Frances Hone, a poor Clare nun who gave a talk here at Washington Theological Union a couple of years ago, of saying how important Francis was in her life. And she reflects, he was, after God, my great support and strength. And Sister Mary Frances focused on that phrase, after God. Because for her, she said, Clare, describing her relationship with Francis, describes her relationship with everything. That everything must come, quote, after God. It is my total self-gift and openness to God which relativizes every other thing. As precious as things are, as beautiful as things are in themselves, I must see them as gifts from the Lord. I must be poor enough to accept them for what they are, because my heart rests in the Lord alone. The way that Clare translated this into reality, of course, was different from Francis. Her poverty was different. And the fact that she lived an enclosed life in a fixed community made her incarnation of this value different from the way Francis and his brothers lived, as it would be different from the way that laymen and laywomen following a Franciscan life in the world also expressed this value of poverty. Clare, for example, unlike Francis, had a house. She had a fixed place. She had a suitable house with 6 or 7 acres of land, a little wall around it, a garden that she and her sisters could grow their vegetables, so that, unlike Francis, she did have a place. She did have a fixed residence. The sisters could also receive money, something that Francis and his brothers could not do. She and her sisters needed to accept money alms in order to support themselves. The way Clare lived that value of poverty was different from Francis. But the inner motivation that sent her on was the same. And that was living within the reality of the gift of God, letting nothing, no other concern, stand in the way. As Clare says in her second letter to Agnes, one thing only is necessary, and I must witness to that one thing. That is God alone. That phrase, the highest poverty, Thomas Merton translates for us as the supreme poverty of having nothing but God. And I think that's a very good translation of what it means in Franciscan terms, the highest poverty. The supreme poverty of having nothing but God. Because when we are inwardly poor, we are empowered to know Him and to possess Him. There can be nothing in the way. We must remain fixed in Him. I think this is the great lesson of interior poverty that Clare can share with all of us who may live in the world, may have our home, may have our possessions, may have our things. Because she, unlike Frances, did have these things. She did not, quote, totally give them up. She had a place, she had a home, she had the things that she needed to live her life. But she had a tremendous inner spirit of poverty, a notion of dependence on the Lord alone, that God alone was her only security. And that the inner secret of a gospel life is learning to let go of myself and my obsessive concerns. I was reflecting on myself the other day, how much I am dependent on sounds and noise to fill the empty spaces of my life. I don't know if you are like me, but many times I go into my room, what's the first thing I do? I turn on that radio. I put that tape in the cassette player. I have to have something somehow to fill me up. And I was reflecting on that the other day. My own compulsive need to, again, put the thing in there to somehow fill my life. Do I even take that time to carve out moments for, quote, tuning in to something that is much more basic in my life? To tune in to my own inner self, to tune in to my own emptiness, my own neediness, the fact that nothing can fill that hole, no music, no sound, no other person really, but God alone. Do I really tune in on that inner need? Do I create in my space the quiet moments where I can really experience myself as standing before the Lord, receiving everything from God, recognizing God's gift, and the fact that God right now is letting me be everything I am, all that I have, all that I am, is coming right now from the hands of the Lord. Am I willing to experience my inner poverty, my inner littleness, my little emptiness, my inner emptiness, and accept myself from the hands of God? This is one of the things, it seems to me, that Clare is teaching all of us in an active world. The need to reflect on our inner need for God, to create the space that we experience God, to forget myself, and to try to be with God in this moment, to forget about my obsessive concerns and to see what God is giving me now, and the people and the things and the circumstances of my life, even in what seems to be the adversities, the hardships, the sufferings, how God is really present. Clare teaches us in her way of contemplative love, of focusing on the mystery of Jesus and who Jesus is in his self-emptying, to be loosened from our ego traps, to begin to recognize that God's love is coming in on us in so many, many, many ways. That God expresses his love for us and the kindness of the people around us and the gifts of God's creation. God reveals his will through all the many small and great things that are happening in my life and causing me to experience God. That Clare's notion of poverty is the emptying of the obsessive concern, again, withdrawing things in somehow to give me meaning, and learning how to stand open-armed in the gifts of God. freeing my heart that there is absolutely only one thing that I ultimately need, and that is the love of God in my life. The realization that the Lord is present to me in his goodness and love, and I have to be free to receive that. And this, it seems to me, is a message that she can give to us living in a late 20th century, very busy world that is very different from living in a 13th century cloistered convent, but that what her sisters, the poor Clares, also show to us today, that they have freed their life from a lot of the obsessive concerns that give ours, and by living this clear life, living in the presence and the power of God, they show us also how in our own busy life we can achieve that inner pocket of peace by emptying ourselves from the obsessive concern with self, to recognize the gift of God, and then also recognizing this, to living in this presence, imitating the self-emptying of the Lord in my service to my brothers and sisters. Clare also has a blessing. We're very familiar with the blessing of Francis. But Clare also has a blessing, and perhaps that is what I'd like to close with today, because it symbolizes so much to me who Clare is. Very simple. May the Lord always be with you, and may you always be with him. A realization that Clare has of our centeredness